gather round for the telling of a tragic tale in three short acts, about the death of Saul and about the marketing of the Bible. There's a word for Saul's death that starts with an S, describing taking one's own life, that I'm going to try not to use in this video because I know that YouTube sometimes will irrationally take down videos that use this word. And so I'll try not to use it. It feels really dumb to come up with euphemisms for that word. We should definitely be able to say that word, but I understand that YouTube is trying to prioritize mental health and has a hard time controlling its content, but here we are. Act 1, brand dilution. I offer you this point by way of a favorite book that I've mentioned before, The Rise and Fall of the Bible, The Unexpected History of an Accidental Book by Timothy Beale. He writes about the ways in which the Bible functions as a brand. He talks about brand equity, for example. When a brand has high value or brand equity, a company may want to extend that brand into other areas and products. It may want to use a strong brand as a vehicle for new or modified products or services. For example, Nike or Puma moves into clothing, or Honda moves into chainsaws, or Sony moves into movie making. That's brand extension. But how many different products can you attach to a brand before that brand begins to lose its meaning? That's brand dilution. Brand dilution is when a brand gets stretched a little too far, or when maybe too many people have access to a prestige brand and it simply loses its value. You could think of luxury car brands or luxury watches, for example, where part of the appeal is its sense of sacredness, its sense that it's holy, that it's set apart, that not many people can get it. You can't just waltz into a Target and buy a Rolex, right? You can't even just waltz into a Rolex dealer and buy a Rolex, I think. You have to get on a waiting list, and they create a lot of scarcity around it. It's a very, it's a kind of a magical elite process, right? Branding. How has the Bible been branded, and to whom and for what reasons, and what happens when you extend the Bible's brand into all kinds of areas? Well, you get into awkward situations. Act 2, the death of Saul. I confess that Saul is one of my favorite biblical characters in some ways. His story is astounding. He's chosen by God and has a bunch of stunning victories, but then gets enmeshed in the difficult politics of his country. In a way, you could say he's dragged down by his people. They want a king, and God says he doesn't really want them to have a king. This is in 1 Samuel 8. And one gets the sense that maybe Saul isn't so much an individual who makes bad choices, although he could come off that way too. But he's a kind of judgment on the community, or a kind of foil to David, who comes later. Saul's death comes after many, many chapters of struggle, including being tormented by an evil spirit from God, which, readers throughout the centuries, or at least the past, several decades, I should say, maybe would suspect is a kind of a euphemism or an ancient understanding for a mental illness of some kind, maybe something like bipolar or schizophrenia, hard to say. Having grown up in an immediate family and even an extended family where some people have struggled with very serious mental illnesses, I don't know, I guess I immediately have a sort of a soft heart for Saul. He falls into a prophetic frenzy when he encounters a band of prophets a couple of times, and there's this saying about him, is Saul also among the prophets? One might also suspect that this prophetic ecstasy might be part of this illness maybe that he has. He broods, and David plays him music, and he feels better. There's a lot of sympathy a person might have there. There are, well, and of course, I mean, one of the key one of the saddest things about Saul's life is the way his life ends. He takes his own life at the end of a battle, or in order to avoid a certain fate in battle. Indeed, of the 7 instances in the Bible where characters commit this ultimate act of self-violence, Five of them come in military scenarios. There's a character named Abimelech in the book of Judges who asks someone else to, an armor bearer, to kill him so that no one can say he's killed by a woman, because a woman throws a giant rock off of a city wall or something like that onto his head and crushes his skull, and he doesn't want to say he's killed by a woman. Well, I guess we all get to read that story, and we basically know he was killed by a woman. But he avoids that fate, he thinks, by having his armor bearer kill him. I don't know really if you could say that that's taking his own life, or if it's someone else technically does it. How you'd categorize that, I don't know. Samson sometimes falls into this category as well. Famously, Samson, the judge in the book of Judges, he pushes down the pillars of a Philistine temple that falls on him, kills everyone around him too. So it's an act of violence against his enemies, I guess, and he is a victim of that as well. There's an Israelite king named Zimri in the book of 1 Kings, who is one of the shortest reigning kings of Israel. He only reigns about a week in his royal position, and he's about to suffer presumably military defeat and death anyway. So he burns down a house or a palace or something like that over himself. An act of self-harm for sure. And then, of course, you have Saul and his armor bearer, both of them, near the end of the book of where's my Bible? The book of 1 Samuel. This is in 1 Samuel 31. The battle pressed hard upon Saul, 31:3. The archers found him, and he was badly wounded by them. And Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, so that these uncircumcised may not come and thrust me through and make sport of me." But his armor bearer was unwilling, for he was terrified. So Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. When his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor bearer and all his men died together on the same day. Wow. What a tragic ending to the book. And it goes on as the Philistines capture his body and behead him and take his armor. There are two other self-imposed deaths in the Bible, which we might more, I guess, classically consider, or at least in the modern sense of taking one's own life, as a very intentional act of self-harm based on despair. Those two characters famously in the Old Testament are Ahithophel, one of David's advisors, who takes his own life by hanging. 2 Samuel 17, when his advice is not followed, he presumably feels that he's become politically and socially and personally worthless in his place. The other character, and probably the most famous one of all, of course, is Judas in the New Testament, whose death in some ways you could read as being modeled after Ahithophel's death. Really, Judas's death comes in 2 different accounts, which are difficult, I'd actually say impossible to reconcile with each other on a literal level. At the end of the book of Matthew 27, Judas hangs himself. So it's a very direct, straightforward act that would be recognizable in almost any era. He's in despair over betraying Jesus. He does this thing as his desperate last act. Throws the money back, gives it back, and clearly regrets the action. In the book of Acts, though, Acts chapter 1, moves by very quickly, and because it occurs at the beginning of Acts, often forgotten about, but we have an alternate story of the death of Judas there, where Judas actually has a field, which I think he's purchased with the money that he got or something like that, and he falls in the field and his body bursts open in this gruesome scene. So in that scene, he really doesn't take his life at all. You could try to reconcile those 2 things in some way, but really those 2 accounts in particular are hard to reconcile. In Matthew, he truly does take his own life. In Acts, it kind of seems like maybe he doesn't. It's a well-known fact too that culturally people can view this ultimate last terrible act of self-harm in very different ways. Very different ways indeed. I'll put a link below that I was reading earlier about these culturally determined ways that people view self-harm. Like, for example, in Japanese culture, there are mixed views about this, but those mixed views include something like a positive view of ending one's own life, or at least seeing ending one's own life as a culturally appropriate response to certain kinds of situations of shame or of failure. The Quran explicitly prohibits harming oneself in this way. The Bible does not. One could say that even in some of these cases, the taking of one's own life is seen as an appropriate action, even if a tragic and a sad one. Christians, of course, have taken this act very seriously as well. It's sort of at least something that I remember hearing even growing up, that somehow taking one's own life was an unforgivable sin, something that God could never forgive. I think many Christians theologically have moved past a view like that into a more sensitive theology, which recognizes the difficulty of mental illness and the many dimensions of self-harm and the reasons for it. But a more cynical take, of course, on Saul's fate would be that really he's degraded in this way in the narrative. He's chosen, but then very viciously unchosen through his poor decision making, including this final last act, because he's kind of set up as an opposite to David. And David emerges then as the ultimate hero, the one chosen, the one after God's own heart. And certainly from a secular scholarly perspective, you could read the books of Samuel, both 1st and 2nd Samuel, as a narrative describing David's rise to power and his totally righteous defeat of his enemies. His enemies all just happened to die by someone else's hand. David would never hurt them himself, right? And even David's most primary enemy, Saul, throughout 1 Samuel, ends up taking his own life, and so the problem is solved, and David can just become king in an unproblematic way. And maybe no doubt in the period of authorship there was some political reality to a gritty story like that, okay? There's a lot of politics in the Bible, a lot of stuff like this. I guess, as I said, my sympathy for Saul goes deeper than just the political reading, though, or just the cynical reading, and might even extend so far as to see him as a tragic victim for being the community choice of the people. He bears a kind of communal guilt for Israel, and certainly whatever kind of mania or frenzy or depression or illness comes upon him seems like something that's done to him, if indeed you read it as an illness and not something that he certainly would want to have in an ideal world for himself, okay? It's a tragic tale. This is my point. Act 3. The cost of accessibility, the price of holiness. As I mentioned, brand dilution. When you extend the Bible's brand out into lots of areas, you could run into some confusing or even some embarrassing situations. I want to point out one of these situations, not in order to heap ridicule upon any particular publisher or their products, but rather to show how uncomfortable this can be, maybe using an extreme example tied to our story. You're like, how are you going to bring this together? This doesn't make sense. Okay, I'm about to, okay? Just hang in there. Enter Refuel, a so-called Bible zine, a magazine that basically includes the Bible integrated with it, but with other features of a magazine. This one, as you can tell maybe by the cover and some of the cover stories, is marketed toward teen boys, with stories like Men of the Sword, How Unstoppable Warriors Got So Awesome, and 70 Ways to Live Out Radical Faith, How to Impress the Girls, even down at the bottom, right? All kinds of things young Christian teen boys should presumably want to read about. And this Bible zine is a little bit old. This didn't just come out this year. This was published in 2005, so almost 20 years old at this point. But basically, in the table of contents, you can see that it narrates all of these historical books. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. And it does so by offering, well, really, actually, I think it actually does almost all of it. Yeah, it does. Yeah, it starts in Joshua 1 and just goes straight through. I think it contains all the verses. But in there, they have these insets. Like, look at this one, just along with Joshua 6, the taking of the city of Jericho and the harem, the total annihilation of all of the people. We have here an inset on relationships with some broody teenagers, standing around, doing some things. So already we're maybe getting a sense here that in this attempt to extend the brand of the Bible to a magazine for teen boys, we're now having to put the Bible together with some other material that's meant to entertain, with some weird results. I mean, at some places this gets really strange. Like here I am in 1 Samuel 28 on the verge of Saul's death, and we've got this weird little inset. Top 10 random fruits. Number 1, the banana. Number 2, the apple. Number 3, the papaya. I agree that papaya could rank number 3 in a list of random fruits, just put there, juxtaposed side by side with God's holy, inspired word. The place, though, where this gets the most tragic, the most embarrassing, the place where we see the problem, the kind of the weirdest zone between these polarities of access on the one hand and holiness on the other, and these two values fighting each other, how do we do it, comes actually on the page in which Saul's death is narrated in 1 Samuel 31, the passage I just read. Check out the inset on the page narrating Saul's death. How to grill the perfect steak. So you've got a fork going into some raw looking flesh there on the same page in which Saul is falling on his sword. You know, you wonder about the editorial process here. I'm sure some totally innocent intern, did this, and it was just a thoughtless process. And, how much abuse can you heap on these editors of this magazine? They're trying to do a hard thing, which is get young people interested in the Bible, but do so in a way that's, also has the Bible, but in an attractive way, but also offers other things. But on the other hand, you can see maybe in an extreme form here, what happens when maybe the Bible is given, too much access, or we're trying to give people too much access to Scripture, and it lessens or lowers the holiness of the text by many notches. Not to mention disrespect Saul in this absolutely tragic moment in which someone is faced with a situation, much like many people who take their own lives, where they just don't feel like they have a way out. That's the end of Act 3. I know, a sad story, but I felt in the mood to reflect on Saul and his fate, and also to talk about these kind of missteps that can happen when we're not thinking about, even in a material format, how we might preserve the holiness of Scripture.